Hey folks, it's Carmen here from Urban Farm School. Just the other day, I posted a video about how I grow my beans here in our Zone 3 garden in Calgary at the Urban Farm Permaculture Project. And I realized afterwards that I left out a couple really important points. So I'd really like to cover those today and basically redo this video. So before we get started, I wanted to show you this really cool structure that I'm standing underneath here in our garden, in one area of our garden. Now this is a structure quite tall. We built it out of mostly 2x4 cedar. And over top of that, we have some rebar panels. And then over top of that, we've got some fine mesh netting. It's a blue netting. Essentially, I believe it's a bird netting. But what this structure does for us is it not only gives us the structure on which to grow some of our taller vegetables and our productive vegetables like the tomatoes over here, and then the beans I've got over here, and sometimes we'll grow corn, cucumbers, and artichokes even under here. Gives us a structure for that, but it also really protects our crops from hail damage. So what we found is that the hail basically just bounces off, and yet we get water coming through, so we don't have to figure out how to manage the water resource. So I've got my beans growing here. And they have really been protected from hail this year. You can see a little bit of damage on some of these outer leaves back here, but the crop itself, all the productive areas have remained completely untouched by hail. So it's been fantastic. And we just recently had golf ball size hail here in the garden. So it was totally worth the effort, time, and money it took to build this structure to protect our productive crops. So that's great. We don't actually have this kind of structure over the remainder of our garden. We've got other strategies in place, but for these crops, this works just beautifully, and we're able to rotate those crops within this structure. So over here, I've got my pole beans growing, and one of the reasons there's a few reasons I prefer pole beans over bush beans, and I'll go into that right now. One is that I find that in an urban environment where space is often limited, growing vertically gives us a lot of production in a small space. So this is, a fantastic wall of green growing up here. So it's actually a really effective teaching tool for my students to see just how much production they can get off of a small space if they're in a small space in their own backyard. So I love the pole beans for that. The other reason I really love pole beans is that with bush beans that I've found, you get the beans in the ground beginning of June. Typically in the springtime, it's not only wet, but it's also cold. Slugs are coming out en masse. And sometimes, these little crops just get going. They just poke their little noses up out of the ground, and the slugs are right on top of them. And even if they do survive that initial onslaught from the slugs, once they start producing beans, the beans are hanging so low and so close to the ground that often the slugs will find their way up onto the beans themselves and start munching the actual vegetable. And so I lose a fair bit of production from that. It's a bit heartbreaking. So for that reason, I prefer pole beans, because if I can get these guys in the ground at the beginning of June, when the soil is super nice and warm, these guys will get growing really quickly, and they'll be up above that slug habitat, if you will, rather quickly. So we've got a few strategies that we use in place to help us protect our crops from slug damage. One of those is to use the pole bean over the bush bean. The other is to delay mulching. So in other words, I will mulch these plants once they're up about 2 feet, but until that time, I'm not going to mulch the soil, because putting straw or dried leaves on the soil once the beans are up would really just provides another great habitat for these guys, so for the slugs. So we want to avoid doing that until they're well up above that zone. The other strategy is, please don't get your beans in too early, because if the soil is even a little bit cold, you've got a couple issues there. You've got the fact that your beans are likely to rot before they germinate, but also if the soil is cold, that's what the slugs love. So if we wait until the soil is warm, beginning of June, we'll get faster growth on these than if we put them in the ground when the ground is cool. So when the ground is cool, they're going to be a slow growth happening, which makes them more susceptible to slug damage, right? But if we get them in the ground when it's nice and warm, they'll shoot up out of the ground and be above that slug damage zone quite quickly. So that's a great strategy. The other reason I really love pole beans is that I think that, as I age, I really really don't like bending over in the garden as much as I used to. I didn't mind spending hours over bush beans harvesting, but I'd much rather at this stage of the game get up on a ladder, obviously that I need one to get up here to harvest all those beans than to bend over in a garden. So this works really, really well for me. Plus, I find that I get way more production off of a pole bean than I do off of a bush bean, bushel for bushel. So I have already actually harvested 3 bushels of beans off of these guys. And I'm sure I've got another bushel yet hanging off of the plants now. So really, really, really productive. So I'm going to show you how I actually grow my beans here. If you look over here, you can see that I've got this twine going from soil level all the way up to the top. Now this is really, this is a twine, it's sort of a one-ply twine called tiger twine. And tiger twine, we get this from Uline, and it's really great because it's quite UV resistant. It doesn't go brittle. This is the same product I use for stringing up my tomatoes, putting on the bobbins that you can see up here. So really, really, really strong, lasts quite a number of seasons, so I can reuse it over and over and over, which I really love. And also, if you'll notice, I've got this twine set up at an angle. And there's a reason for this, and I'll tell you what that is. That is that as the plants actually grow up, they vine themselves up following the angle of the twine. But the beans themselves, when they grow, will fall away from that angle. And so you'll be able to easily differentiate the bean from the vine. So it makes picking it a lot easier. So when I'm up on a ladder way up there harvesting beans, I can very easily see where the beans are and where the vines are. So that's really, really handy. This is a system that I actually developed for a big greenhouse operation that I worked for a number of years ago. So I love these flat Italian beans. See if I can find some more. They're a little flatter for you to look at. These are really a fantastic bean. I love them. They're an open pollinated heirloom variety. They're super tender. And they last a long time on the vine. They stay really well, and they'll produce really well for fresh eating until such time as the beans themselves start to fill out the pods. If I see that happening on these plants, what I'll usually do is let them fill out, and then I'll harvest the whole pod and shell it and eat them like fresh beans without the pod. But for the most part, depending on the variety, we'll get some great beans that have that even hold when they get quite a bit larger, and even when they fill out. So I'm always experimenting with varieties, trying to find the ones I love. I've also got a few purple beans in here, really nice purple beans. I have some yellow flat Italians as well. So these guys are really productive, and I love the flat Italians for another reason, and that's that they're so meaty. And so 2 of the 3 bushels that I've already harvested from here, I pressure canned. So I've got fresh beans to eat all winter long. So we're set up for beans this year, which is great. But they seem to hold up well to the added heat and pressure of pressure canning, which I think is great. So what it was that I wanted to cover in the previous video that I didn't was the aspect of seed saving. So for these guys, what I usually do is when I'm either on my first harvest, typically on my first harvest or my second harvest, depending on the time of the season. First harvest, I notice some of the more vigorous plants. So I'm always paying attention to which plants are more vigorous than some of the other ones within the same variety. So what I'll do is I'll tag those plants with a piece of colored string or some a clip or something that identifies that plant. And then I'll let those particular vines stay untouched, unharvested. So in this case here, we've got a beautiful flat Italian. These guys are absolutely massive. They're about almost a foot long. You can see they're really starting to fill out now. So these are pods that I won't harvest. I'll leave all of the beans on this vine. Typically I do three vines per variety, so I have a good amount of beans to work with in the fall. And I'll just let these guys stay and ripen on the vine completely. They'll become overripe, and at the end of the season they'll be dried. The pods will be dry. At that point I will take these off, bring them inside the house to let them dry just the rest of the way. They'll already be sort of rattling around in the pods, so I know they're ready. And then I'll take them out of the pods and label them, and these will create the seeds that I'm going to use for the following year. Now I can do that because these are open pollinated varieties. And so what that means is that I can safely and confidently save the seed from these varieties, knowing that I'll get exactly the same plant the following year, which is not what happens with hybrid varieties. So I love the old-fashioned varieties. They're tried and true. They're really wonderfully productive. And again, I love experimenting with different varieties because I love to save my seeds, but I also like to share my seeds because I figure if they've been really productive and awesome for me, that other people are going to love them too. So thanks so much for allowing me to share my bean growing operation with you. It's a total green happiness here, really wonderful. So I hope you're having lots of abundance in your garden as well this year. Thanks for allowing me to share this video with you. If you've enjoyed it, please do consider subscribing to us online or checking us out online at urbanfarmschool.ca, where you can learn to grow some awesome.